You know what? Let's start with the rage-filled comments about things being way too expensive right from the intro today. This pocket knife costs $550. What's going on, everyone? Back with another episode of Stuff and Things, and today we are taking a look at my new all-time favorite pocket knife. The Para 2 and the Para 3 are now going to the wayside. Now, this knife is a huge step up from a typical EDC choice, and there is a lot that goes into it, so let's take a closer look at the Reeve Sebenza 21. These are the knives that set the standard against which others are compared to. Reeve's knives are known for their insanely tight tolerances and precision machining, giving them a fit and finish unlike anything else on the market. The Sebenza was first developed in 1987, long before I was even born, and the profile has experienced minor changes over the years up until 2008. That year was the 21st year of the Sebenza, and to celebrate, Chris introduced the Sebenza 21. Now, there are two sizes when choosing a Sebenza, either a small or a large, and I of course opted for the large. There are also a number of different blade profiles and materials to choose from when ordering. This one fits my style perfectly with an S35 VN Tanto blade, and the black micarta slabs are inlaid inside of the titanium. Next to it is a spalted beech version with a different blade shape for comparison. Now, there are so many tiny details to talk about when it comes to these knives, so let's start with the big one. It's a frame lock. Or for the know-it-alls, it is an integral lock. This frame lock design, which is found in thousands of knife designs today, was actually designed by Chris Reeves and was made popular through the Sebenza. Now, since Chris is the actual designer of this lock, you best believe that this is one of the nicest frame locks out there. The lockup on the 21 and pretty much everyone I've ever handled is just rock solid. It honestly does feel like a fixed blade, although I know it's not. This knife just all around feels like it could take a beating, and there is absolutely no blade play or movement in that at all. The top part of the titanium frame that actually locks up with the tang of the blade is treated. This thing is super smooth when it engages as well as disengaging. And then the lockup is where you might find something that kind of varies from other higher quality knives. For the most part, when you're looking at a frame lock like this, you want an early lockup. If you get in here real close, you will see that this is almost at a 50 or 60% lockup, meaning that that lock bar is traveling almost 50 or 60% across of that blade tang. Now, this is actually very common with the Sebenzas. You can actually loosen them up and kind of pull on the blade a little bit to get it a little bit earlier. But for the most part, that is very normal with these knives. It makes the lockup very strong. And because of the way they treat and handle these materials, that really should not change over the entire life of the knife. When opening this thing up, it does have a nice detent that you can feel just before it locks up. Such a satisfying noise and feeling. Now, while we are on the topic of materials, this entire frame is basically made out of titanium. It has this very nice, sandy, almost gritty feeling texture. It's not super grippy, but at the same time, it feels really good in your hand, and it feels like it does provide a little bit of grip as opposed to something that would be completely polished. This version is of course inlaid with that black micarta, one of my favorite handle materials of all time. So when I saw this version and it had that black micarta inset in the titanium, two of my favorite knife materials, I knew that I had to have it. The titanium actually does not stop there. The pocket clip is also titanium. This thing has been in my pocket for a little over 2 months now, so you can see a little bit of wear on that titanium and the finish. And you can actually see the way that they set the clip inside of the titanium on the frame. At first, I was a little bit worried that this thing would not be strong enough. It is not the strongest clip that I've ever felt, but when I do put this in my pocket, it rides relatively low. I would not call it a deep carry clip, but it does feel pretty secure. And of course, if I am carrying a relatively expensive pocket knife like this, I am constantly doing one of these, checking to make sure that it's there. Now, also down here towards the pocket clip, you will notice a hole there. There was actually a lanyard and a pin in there. Let me see if I can actually find that. Oof. Here is the box that this thing came in. It did come with a little Chris Reeves notebook from Blade HQ, which is where I ordered this. Comes with all of the documentation and certificate of authenticity, stuff like that. It does, of course, come with the cloth, Chris Reeves logo on there, a little tube of grease, and an Allen key to take the thing apart. And then here is the little lanyard pin and lanyard still attached to it. So that little pin there was in that back hole of this knife, and I simply took the knife apart and then took the pin out altogether instead of just cutting it off. There's nothing wrong with it. You could cut it off and leave the pin in there, but people say that it will then rattle around. It could possibly fall out as well if I had to guess. And I just don't care to have lanyards on my knives, so I took it off, and that hole actually matches the machining hole there on the front. Now let's talk about this blade for a second. I do apologize if it is a little fingerprinty and sticky because I do actually use this knife. Fun fact, which I hit on in the knife banter that I did with Blade HQ, is that Sebenza actually means work. This is a heavy user knife. Yes, it is very expensive, but you should be able to use something like this, especially when it is so high quality. So again, I opted for the Tanto blade because I really love the way all the grinds look in the light, and I actually use that tip. I mentioned this in the knife banter video. I actually use that to kind of scrape things if I ever need to scrape. I think it adds a little bit more strength on the tip there as opposed to just a traditional drop point. It will make it a little bit difficult to sharpen because you're actually dealing with two edges there, but I'll cross that bridge when I get to it. Now this blade, much like all Chris Reeve's knives, is made out of a CPM S35 VN steel. What does that mean? I don't really know. If I pull out the card here, you will see it actually has the information. As you can see here, it is about a 59 or 60 on the Rockwell hardness scale. Now, a lot of people are going to complain about this. If they're paying top dollar for a knife, they would expect something a little bit different. But there is a reason why Chris Reeves developed this steel and uses it in almost all of their knives. In my opinion, it is a great steel for an EDC blade. A lot of people will complain that it is a little bit too soft. I really haven't experienced that. Like you guys know, I'm really just opening letters and boxes and things like that with my EDC knives. I'm not super hard on them. So this thing has retained an edge pretty well so far. Like I said, I have been carrying this for almost a month and a half or 2 months now. It could probably use a little bit of touching up soon, but it still feels relatively sharp and I have no issues with it. Whenever a manufacturer releases a new knife, it doesn't matter what blade steel that they use, people are going to complain. That's just how it goes. I personally don't have a problem with the S35 VN. I actually have another knife with the same type of steel. I should be able to put a nice edge back on here if I ever need to, but for now I'm just gonna rock with it until it gets a little bit more dull. Now for some other notes, the spine of the blade here does have a little bit of roundness to it, so it does feel pretty good, but obviously you're not going to be striking any fire steel off of the back of that. If you look at the tip down here as well, you can see it is fairly thick all the way through there, so I really don't see any issue with stabbing and prying just a little bit with these things. For a knife like this and pocket knives in general, it's not a good idea to pry with them. I do carry a little tiny Gerber shard as a pry tool, but in a pinch, if I needed to get underneath anything, I think that that tip would hold up just fine. Now for the thumb studs, you may have noticed that there is only one on the left side of the blade because I am right-handed. It's sort of conical in shape. There are little ridges on there, and this thing is actually pressed into its hole. And then on the reverse side, you can still see the extreme detail that they put into something as small as a thumb stud. It's sort of dimpled on this other side, and this is actually an option. They of course make these knives for right-handed users, left-handed users, or if you want to opt for a thumb stud on each side, you can do that as well, and I believe it is just a little bit of an upcharge. Now it did take a little while to get used to the opening of this knife because it is a little bit down further on the blade as compared to some others that I'm used to. Once you get used to it, you can stick your thumb in there and sort of flick it out, actually pushing the blade out at about a 45-degree angle. But my favorite way to open this thing up is actually just to use the fatty part of my thumb and then open it very, very slow because this thing is so smooth. That has a lot to do with the tolerances, which I will cover here in a second. The only other thing that I really want to talk about the blade is how centered it is. Again, this has something to do with those crazy tolerances. As you can see here, the centering on this blade is damn near perfect. I think I would really have to get in there with a microscope to actually tell if it was off at all. And I've actually completely taken apart this knife about 3 times since I've owned it. Completely apart, with the blade removed from the actual body of the knife, the handle scales completely apart. I've put it back together on 3 separate occasions and it goes back to being completely centered every single time. Now for me to talk about the tolerances, it really will not do it justice, so I will leave links to a Blade HQ exclusive down in the description below. They actually went to the factory out in Idaho and met with Chris, and he went over in extreme detail everything that goes into these knives, and it is honestly super impressive. I highly recommend you check it out. If you think about some of the tightest tolerances used in like aerospace grade technology, think about that, but even tighter. The amount of precision and detail that goes into these knives is just crazy, and you really can't appreciate it until you hear the whole backstory or hold one of these in your hand. It is so precise actually that if you take this knife apart and you flip one of the very tiny thin washers the opposite way, that could actually throw off the centering of this knife. Everything is super hand fit. They even take the little pivots in there and the washers and hand sand them down. That way when you put this knife together, it is completely perfect every single time. I really can't put into words the details that go into this knife, but for my best comparison, the smoothness of the Sebenzas when opening and closing, the best thing that I could compare it to would be to take two pieces of glass, put some oil on one, lay the other piece of glass on top of it, and then sort of slide it around. That is a very close feeling to what these knives actually feel like when you are using them. You can sort of see here as I push this thing close, it is not jittery like this. It is just buttery smooth. It is so hard to show this stuff on video, so if you ever have the chance to handle a Sebenza 21, I highly recommend it. Or any knife from Chris Reeves for that matter. One other thing that I kind of skipped over on this blade was the jimping. It's damn near perfect. I really can't say anything else about it. It's not super aggressive, like it's going to rip my thumb up, but if I really put pressure on there, my thumb just locks into it. And that is just another addition to the perfectness of these knives. This may just be my OCD kicking in here, but I was sitting around here the other day just looking at this knife up close, like super close. I actually took my fingernail and ran it across the back of this jimping here and counted every single groove that went into the spine of this blade. From the back to the front, there are actually 21 grooves on the Sebenza 21. I was kind of freaking out when I found that out. I immediately texted my friend who also carries one of these every day, and I was like, yo, this is really weird, but count the jimping on the back of your Sebenza. He texted me back right away and was like, holy shit, it's 21, Sebenza 21. I'm sure there's information about that out there online already, but it was very cool to find that out for myself just by looking at this thing up very close. So now let's go back to what I was talking about in the very beginning of this episode. This knife costs $550. This is actually one of the first Grail knives that I ever purchased, and I am very glad that I did. Now I'm using the term Grail knife meaning something that is typically way outside of your normal price range. Maybe it's something that is hard to hunt down, or it could be simply something that is at the very top of your wish list. This term can really apply to any kind of knife depending on the person and their different situations. And typically, since the average person is not spending $500 or more on a pocket knife, this definitely falls into that category for most. Maybe something like the Boker Mermaid will be really hard to come by someday, and that could be a Grail knife for someone. Maybe. I mean, probably not, but you get the point. So now I'm not making this video to tell people to go out and buy a super expensive pocket knife. Most people will say, so what, it's just a pocket knife. My $15 Gerber paraframe can cut things just as well as a Sebenza. You could really compare this to something like watches. A Bulova Precisionist tells time just like a Casio G-Shock. What's the point in buying something very expensive and high-end if something like this does it the exact same way? Again, that is something that is really up to the user, the person who is actually spending their money on things like this. If I put a similar edge on this knife and this knife, are they going to cut the same? Sure. Of course, the materials are a lot different, and the precision that goes into something like this is much more precise than something like a Gerber paraframe, but they're still gonna cut things. They're still gonna open envelopes and open boxes, so what is the point of spending that much money on a knife like this? Is there a point? No, I'm not gonna say that there is a reason to own a knife like this. But I will tell you that if you do appreciate finer things in life, especially when it comes to detailed machining and precision tolerances, really nice materials like the S35VN titanium black micarta, and you want to have a pocket knife that you can take apart and clean and put back together hundreds of times and not have to worry about it being messed up or off-centered or rubbing, anything like that, then maybe something like a Chris Reeves Sebenza 21 would be a good knife for you. This thing is straight up a workhorse of a knife. I do not feel bad about using this thing. I will get a little bit upset once it does get more scratched up and dinged up. Hopefully I never drop it, but if I mess up the blade at all, I can always send it back to Chris Reeves for their warranty. It's basically like a spa treatment for the knife. They will completely refinish everything and then send it back to you. So I'm not here to justify my purchase of buying one of my first Grail knives. And I'm not here to tell you guys how to spend your money, but if you are a knife nut and you have not considered a Sebenza 21, I highly, highly recommend it. This thing is comfortable and classy, and it really is a must-have for any knife enthusiast out there. So those are my final thoughts on the Reeve Sebenza. This thing has seen a ton of pocket time, and I don't think any knives out there are going to take this place anytime soon. So this thing is going back to its home. It's going to be living here for a long while. If you guys have any questions on anything else related to the Sebenza 21, let me know in the comments down below and I will try to answer those. If you're interested in checking out all of their different options, I will of course leave links to those in the description down below. And if you are new to this channel, consider clicking subscribe because I make new videos every week. That's going to be all for today. So as always, thank you guys for watching and I will talk to you in the next one.